Welcome again to the Atma Paradigm. This is session number 2 of part 2, and today we're looking at what's out there. Is reality real? What's matter made of? I start you with a recap from where we are at this moment. We are working from the premise that consciousness is not produced by the activities of the brain. Now, we're reliant on all the work we did in part 1 that this is a starting point. We are not bringing in any more physicalist kind of notions of consciousness. That water has passed. We are now establishing consciousness as the property that is different from those associated with physical matter. We're assigning consciousness as the inherent property of its own form of reality, its own facet of existence, called a field of consciousness. And that's our postulation for the moment, and you'll see why it fits in with our analysis as we go through today. We've also established that this field of consciousness has its own fundamental unit, which is the Atma, the smallest entity possessing the property of individual conscious ability. So we're defining consciousness in terms of its observed properties and these unique functions that deem it to be a fundamental feature of reality. So those features, as we've discussed before, include our sense of self and personal existence and the subjective experience we have of qualia. Now, we know that we've established that experience of qualia may be shared amongst other species, but perhaps the sense of our own existence may be the prerogative of humans and maybe some other species. In using this word consciousness, sometimes it's used in different ways in the literature as a phenomenon of subjective experience or the source of the phenomenon. And we are taking it that those two principles really work together. So the distinction made between consciousness as a phenomenon and the source of consciousness arises from the kind of physicalist notion that consciousness is produced from something other than itself, i.e. in their terms some kind of physical neural interaction. However, we are defining the Atma as the source of the phenomenon of consciousness and as composed of consciousness itself. So the Atma, both the source and the phenomenon, as a field and its property are inseparable. We'll be discussing fields next week a little bit. So I hope that you're comfortable with me using it in a kind of generalized term. Now, the question to be explored in this part is the nature of the interaction between this fundamental property of conscious, intrinsic to the Atma, and the physical properties of the brain, body, and the objects of the external world. And we had this kind of simplified illustration of the elementary functions. So we have proposed that consciousness is able to interact with the physical systems of the body, brain, and senses via a subtle interface system, which we are loosely calling the mind, i.e. in inverted commas. Now that's what this whole section from today on is meant to deal with. How do we explain that? How do we substantiate that? Now, you'll have to remember that this has been a huge bugbear of philosophy of mind for perhaps thousands of years. So you're not going to get a pat answer. I can't just give you one little thing. But the explanation, it's not weird, it's not obtuse. I don't think it's even that complicated. But it does require us to establish a few key logical premises on which to build an explanation. So, as we've seen, there are many misconceptions about the nature of consciousness and matter that basically preclude a clear picture of how it may be natural for consciousness to have a relationship with mind and the brain and body. So, the questions that come up, are there not problems of what's called interactionism? How different functions or substances interact? We touched a little bit about what is consciousness made of and what is mind of. And we did indicate that we need to kind of explore, well, what is matter made of before we think that's a reasonable question. And I want to deal with that in a lot more detail today. So we're going to focus on what we know of physical reality. And we're going to explore some of the ways that philosophers of the past and even present have speculated about the nature of reality. We're going to cover things like immaterialism, idealism, and realism. And we're also going to explore monism and dualism. These will all be defined in due course. And we're doing monism and dualism in the context of philosophy of mind and physical stuff rather than the big ontological picture of what is the ultimate source of existence. That's for another day. So today, here are the principles that we need to deal with. How best to understand physical matter. Is the world real? And is it objectively real? Is consciousness real? Is the mind real? If so, if all these are real, then how do we reconcile several distinct things that we consider equally real? This is the big issue. And is there an ontology? And I'm afraid I'm going to use this word ontology a lot today, because ontology basically means the study of being. That, the beingness, i.e. it deals with the questions of reality and existence. So is there, and it's a philosophical approach, so is there a philosophical ontology dealing with reality and existence that can accommodate the interaction of such distinct and real things as consciousness, mind, and matter? And we're going to start with a common conception of the world. Matter is the hard stuff. This is a picture of a statue of a guy called Dr. Johnson, who's an historic figure, and this is meant to be an historic incident. He came out of church one day where he'd heard a sermon that he really disagreed with. And he was so angry that he went up to this huge stone there lying on the ground, and he kicked it with all his might with the words, "I refute it thus." So what was he refuting? Well, I think the vicar or whoever was doing the preaching that day was speaking the philosophy of immaterialism, which had been devised by George Berkeley, who was the Bishop of Cloyne in Ireland. Now, Berkeley was challenging what he saw as the kind of widespread adoption of materialism in the early 18th century. And he wanted to point out that our understanding of everything was as mental experiences. And this is something we have discussed in our first part. Unfortunately, what he said was then, and maybe, he contributed to it, but it's been taken rather simplistically that Berkeley is the champion of the idea that there is no real world out there. And that's what Johnson was railing against. He kicks the stone to prove that there obviously is a large, hard object which can hurt your toes. So he was willing to sacrifice himself in the pursuit of philosophy on this particular point. Now, the thing is, he didn't actually really deal with the point that Berkeley's making. Because, all right, there may be a big stone out there, but Berkeley is still correct that Johnson's experience of that stone is only in terms of the sensory properties that he experienced, i.e. the hardness, the solidity of that stone and it's meeting his toes. All Johnson can say is, I have experienced hardness, I have experienced solidity. That's what we know. Now, what gave rise to that experience of hardness and solidity? That was the point that Berkeley was really kind of exploring. We'll come to that in a little bit, but I want to just first of all use this as an example to explore that we can analyze the nature of the world in terms of the properties that we experience about it. It's something I've mentioned before. I want to get into a little more detail. And I'm going to use an example from my old student days. And we're talking nearly 50 years now, when I was reading architecture. And we had one lecture after another about bricks. Now you might thought, what can you say about a brick? But apparently our lecturers thought you could say plenty. So they would speak about it. And here's just some aspects of what you can say about a brick. I'm not going to go through them all. I'm not trying to sell them to you. But basically, whatever these properties are, these are perceptual. These are what are perceived, what it is like, its weight, its shape, its color, its dryness, its porosity, dimension. These are all things we can perceive. And we can even quantify all of these properties. So they're empirically perceived properties. And then there's other types of properties which are functions. And these are all the different things that you can use a brick for. This is what it does. And bricks are really useful in all these purposes. Not just building walls, but they have insulation, they structure, they can bond, they can help to weatherproof, they are even decorative. So these are the functional attributes. So basically, a brick, this hard object, similar to the stone that Dr. Johnson kicked, is known by its perceived and functional properties, what it's like and what it does. These are the properties, these properties are manifest to us. They're what we experience. Now, next week we'll discuss what gives rise to these perceived properties. But for now, we're going to pursue the question, all right, okay, bricks, properties, fine, but what's it made of? Come on, let's really look at, this is a hard object. What's it made of? So, here's a slide which takes you from brick to quark. Again, we're not a physics lecture. We'll go through this quite quickly. Basically, brick is made from sand or clay, which you mix with a bit of water, turns into a dough, you put it in a mold and you fire it. And the interesting thing that happens when you fire a brick is that it starts to become kind of crystalline and forms this lattice, the silica crystal lattice that is mentioned there. And the reason the silica crystal lattice can form is because of the nature of this silicon dioxide molecule, which you see there. It's got the grey atom, which is silicon, and it's connected to two oxygen atoms by this double valence thing. And the idea is that those valence bonds can be broken and then can fit into the little lattice you see on the left of the molecule. It's okay, so that's a lattice, it has its properties, and those properties are related to the properties of the molecule. So, but does the molecule really look like that? No, not really. That's a kind of diagrammatic thing. We have to look at these atoms on their own. So that's the next picture, the atom. And that's this picture of the planetary orbit style description is probably the one that still has been taught in schools generally. It actually is over 100 years old. It's from Rutherford in 1913 or so. And it indicates that you've kind of got these atoms, protons and neutrons in the nucleus and electrons as little particles flying around it. Now, things have moved on in the last 100 years and very quickly moving to the far, which is my right-hand side of my screen, you see we've got an electron and a quark and a whole, it's called a zoo of other subatomic entities. But the interesting thing is so these are the things that make up everything else, even the brick, all made up of these electrons and quarks. So are they solid and have they got substance? Well, let's look at an electron just as an example of these type of particles. It's a thing of mass, me, which basically is the mass of an electron. It's got spin, half, and it's got an electric charge, -1 e, which is an electron volt. So it has no dimension, it has no volume. It is considered a point particle, but it's got mass because it's composed of energy. And one of the best definitions I read recently in one paper described it as an electron is best understood as a packet of information located at a point in space. So basically, an electron is a thing of energy and information. And you can say the same for all the other little bits that make up bricks and the whole of the world. They are things of energy and information. The world of physical matter is basically energy and information. Energy with information content, and by being energy with information content, it manifests as observable properties. So now we have to kind of deal with this question. back to George Berkeley. His basic point is like this. We perceive ordinary objects and we perceive ideas. Therefore, objects are ideas. Or at least the point is really, how can you tell the difference between them? So, I seem to be missing. I'm going to deal with that in a few slides along. So I'm just going to move on. This kind of gave rise to certain ideas, which are called idealism. That, well, maybe if we can tell the difference between what gives rise to our perception of objects and ideas, well, maybe they're practically the same thing. And I'll show you a couple of slides a little later, which probably would have fitted in better here on that point. So hard physicalist idealism is the idea that, well, maybe just consciousness or the mind exists, but that they're conflated, that only mental states exist and there's no perceiver of them. Perception is all that exists. The world beyond the mind does not exist. A kind of softer version, which might be that consciousness and mind are conflated, or maybe they're not. Maybe perception is all that exists, but maybe what we're perceiving is some aspects of the outside world. It's just that we will never know what it is actually like, because all we will ever experience is how we perceive it within our minds. So they're not saying the outside world necessarily doesn't exist, they're just saying it's not as knowable. And this idea of understanding the world in terms of properties starts to go into a different tack. There's a thing called bundle ontology, and they describe it like this. What we think of as an apple is a bundle of experience properties. You know, we know its shape, its color, its taste, its smell, its feel. It even makes a nice crunching noise when it's bitten. So we are experiencing this apple in terms of this bundle of perceived properties. Now, bundle ontology of Hume, Russell, and others say basically material objects are nothing more than the bundles of what are called compresent properties, i.e. equally simultaneously present properties all together. And so these are properties or powers that affect and are affected by each other, and that's what an object is. It is just properties. And this is the slide I wanted to give you in relationship to Berkeley. It's a set of slides showing how, you know, we can actually conceive how we might be fooled into thinking that maybe there isn't something out there. So is this an example of idealism? Those with sharp eyes will recognize that this is a photograph of Gary Lineker and co. at the Match of the Day studio. There's a big green screen behind them. So that's what they're sitting in reality. That's what you're experiencing on the screen of your television. Now, the interesting thing is that some of this is veridical, this bit, i.e. those guys are there, they're sitting at their desks, they're discussing things, that's real. But then you've got all this that you are equally seeing, which is virtual. Is it veridical? Is it real? And the point is, how do you know what you're perceiving is veridical, actually there, or whether it has been generated by the mind in the same way as the screens at the back, all that imagery is generated by the computers and the broadcast? How do you know? So that's a kind of a little bit of the justification given for idealism. However, if you take this point, well, if properties express all powers to things, i.e. that everything, you know, that the properties are everything that constitutes that being a thing, well then you might say maybe there are only properties. The question is there an underlying substance which holds those properties, which bears those properties, that becomes the philosophical question. And the Atma Paradigm, and it's not alone on this one, will say, yes, there must be something which bears the properties. Why? Because otherwise, how do the properties hold together? What is actually keeping them as a group, and a consistent group, one that is experienced both by ourselves consistently and by others? So why are these properties united within our perception of an object? And the other thing is, we don't see kind of just properties flying around on their own, floating in space. They seem to be tied to objects. So this is the theory of substantivism. And we're champions of this particular idea of that there must be a substrate that holds the properties of the things we experience together, are Aristotle. So he called it a substrate, that which survives to change, and Locke, who referred to as substantia, which he defined as the support of those qualities we find existing and which cannot subsist without something to support them. I.e., there must be a bare something, something that doesn't have properties of its own other than the property to support other properties. And this is really interesting, because this is part of the Sankhya philosophy that we are going to bring in order to explain the nature of the way that physical matter actually operates. And probably no other school of thought has actually had such a brilliant analysis as Sankhya does of this aspect of properties and how they are born by a substrate. So the issues that normally come up, we will look at next week. Substance of the substrate, what is it? What is this thing if it doesn't have properties that we can perceive? And what is the ontological distinction between the properties and the property bearers? All answered within the Sankhya system. So all these issues of idealism we can put aside. We can actually move ahead with a full understanding and confidence that the world is real. Now, so understanding physical stuff in terms of properties and functions or energy and information doesn't make the world less real than you think it is. It is as real as you take it to be. There is a real world out there which is giving rise to the impressions and experiences that you are having. So our empirical, i.e. our sensory experience of the observable properties, i.e. the shapes, the colours, the forms, the smells, the tastes and everything else of the world around us, all of those happen because those properties are actual characteristics within the things of the outside world. They are distinct from qualia in terms of format, but they are properties which give rise to our experiences. So, kind of conclusions. The outside world is real, albeit as energy and information. Now, I know that some will feel that the Bhagavad Gita, as an example, quite rightly questions, well, how can you call something real if it isn't permanent or ever existing? If it's going to change and disappear, that isn't as real as it could be. And that's fair enough. In terms that we are dealing with here, we are calling the outside world real, and I hope I'll be forgiven for this, that it's something that is manifest to be experienced while we are here ourselves. So in that sense, we're calling the outside world real. There is something there which can be experienced. And mental properties and functions are also real. And so real as in actual and veridical, i.e. meaning that our experiences correspond with something out there. There is something out there which exists to be experienced. And consciousness, the ability to experience all of this, is also real. But is it objective? And this is something that is often raised. Is the outside world purely objectively real? Now, normally that is meant to mean that the outside world has no, has not been influenced, has not been affected by the nature of consciousness and the mind. It exists whether we observe it or not. So is it objectively real? And at this stage, I'm going to say no. And the reason is because we are going to discuss how the outside world has a relationship with mind and consciousness. And something that has a relationship with mind and consciousness cannot be considered to be absolutely objective. And if something isn't 100% objective, well, it's not objective. So we will explore that a little further along, and you will see that there is an important relationship existing between the outside world and consciousness. It's a little further down in this series of talks. So the Atma Paradigm does not favor what is being mentioned these days as naive realism. The idea that there's a real world which objectively exists and it has no relationship to consciousness or any other perception of it. That's a little naive, and it doesn't fit in with a lot of the aspects of modern science, and it doesn't fit in with the philosophy and ontology of the Atma Paradigm. So, if we're going to suggest that we've got three components of reality, the outside world, the mind, as the interface between the outside world and ourselves as conscious entities, which is also real, so how do we tie them together? And this becomes the big question, and it's, you know, there's been so many efforts that over thousands of years to try and tie these together. I'm going to look at some of the efforts, and we're going to categorize them. I'm not going to try and analyze each idea and tell you about what I think of its validity or its strong points or its weak points. I'm going to categorize them in a particular way which may be a little different and surprising to some of you who may be familiar with these. First of all, we're going to look at the category of theories which are monism, which means basically oneness, that the whole of existence is just one, and I'm going to use the word thing. Actually, I should mention that I'm going to use words like thing and stuff an awful lot. I'm not trying to be colloquial. I'm not trying to sound cool. I'm using these words because they're so generalized that you can apply a thing. Could be an object, it could be a concept, an idea, it could be the nature of, you know, it can be used in many different ways. And I'm using thing and stuff without trying to be more definitive. So the types of monism. There's physicalist types of monism, and we'll go through those: existence, priority, and genus types. Ontological nihilism is a type of monism. Russellian monism, ADVAITA, and non-duality. So let's go through them. Physical monism. There's a whole bunch of different types. Probably existence, priority, maybe genus are the most well-known. And basically they work by saying the world is just one thing. And they use the word token as a thing word, or just one type, or just one whole, or just one nature. And the interesting thing is that in doing this, they're saying it's one type. They recognize the plurality of the things they are putting within that type, or within the whole, or within one nature. So there is a plurality which is being attempted to be unified within the idea of a group category. Property monism is the idea that only one object actually exists, and that could be your left foot. Everything else somehow or other is derived from it. Now, that is an example of cause and effect, where the effect, everything else in the world, is being caused by just one single object. So you could say that one object is the only thing that exists because everything else is derivative. Now, that's an interesting kind of cause and effect, but it also questions, well, what is the reality of all those effects? Those things that are derived from the whole, from the original, are they also real? So all of these particular ones regard mind and consciousness as an emergent property of physical stuff, so that kind of destroys their monism again. So my point of these about these ones, they're not absolute monist theories. They all have aspects which have to give due regard for something, a plurality of objects and relationships within those objects, with themselves and with the whole. That's not pure monist theory. Ontological nihilism. Now, nihilism, just general, values, knowledge, it's all baseless. There's no validity to anything, But ontological nihilism kind of is a form of monism. Basically, you're saying, well, we're going to explain everything in this world in one way, that nothing exists. But then you have to explain, well, why is there something that then is going to become nothing, and how does nothing become something? That's not monism anymore. You're having to juggle two different forms of reality and try to say they're all united in one way or another, but they're not entirely related, because you never get around having to explain what the status of one of them is in relationship to the other. So without resolving current and ultimate existence, it's not real monism. Russellian monism is something that's getting a bit of a revival thanks to the panpsychists. And Russellian monism basically suggests that consciousness, mind, matter all link back to the same underlying substrate of property, a substrate which gives rise to the properties that each of these individuals have. So this is a kind of cause and effect, Satkaryavad, the idea that the effect, whether it's consciousness, whether it's the physicality of the world, actually emanates from some physical properties which give rise to all the other properties. So again, that's not monism. That is an example of trying to accept that there is variety that can be explained in relationship to some commonality between them all. But it's not pure, utter monism. Now, probably the most articulate presentation of monism really comes from ADVAITA of Shankara. And basically, it's, instead of saying that there is a physical substrate, as in Russellian monism, basically the idea is the substrate is pure consciousness, which is defined as Nirguna Brahma. And this gives rise to the sense of the individual consciousness, and the individual consciousness experiences something which it takes to be the world, Jagat, and is actually fooled into thinking that the world is real. So the idea is that our supposed experience of the mind and the outside world is an illusion. We are actually pure consciousness, but somehow or other we are fooled by ignorance or Maya, illusion, into thinking that this world is real. Now, this is as close as you can get to monism, but it's still not the real thing, because you've still got to deal with why is pure consciousness thinking itself to be an individual like you and me, and we're experiencing the imagery and our interaction with the world around us, and that's an illusion. But what is the ontology of the illusion? How is it able to affect me? Is it real? Because if it's real, then you've got Brahman and you've got Maya, the illusion. And if Maya is not real, then your problem is, why is something which is Nirguna Brahman being affected by something which is not actually real? So the whole thing really falls down as monism. It may be an interesting philosophy, and I'm not trying to kind of argue and say the validity of each of these points. I'm just saying they're not actually absolute monist ideas. And of course, then you've got the contemporary non-dualism. And most of these kind of grew out of the effect or the influence of kind of various gurus coming over in the last 100 years to the West. Of course, probably from the 60s, there was a kind of reaction against divisive politics and nationalism. We just had a world war. the reaction against tribal religions. So people were longing for an idea which gave a vision of greater social cohesion, peace, love, and understanding. So, you know, you've got people like John Lennon saying, I am he as you are he, and we are all together. Or Pink Floyd, I remember saying, I am you, and what I see is me. This is this idea that somehow or other there is just one unified consciousness and we're all in this together. And a lot of gurus are going around trying to kind of offer this as a philosophy of life. And to many, it might help them make sense of the difficulties, the problems, and the troubles that they have in the world, the baggage that they take upon themselves. Maybe there's some therapeutic value for some, but it's impossible to live in that aspect. So, for instance, there's the idea that maybe the perfection of love is absolute union of being with another conscious being. I wonder if that's actually the perfection of love, or maybe it's kind of running away from the responsibilities and the generosity of spirit that's actually required to experience love. But I'm not here to critique. The point is, these non-dualistic ideas peddled by the various gurus of this world currently are definitely not truly monist. They are a hodgepodge of many different aspects. And we'll come back to what aspects are being included here. But now I want to move on to, if you like, the opposite end of the spectrum, dualism. And there's various types of dualism. Substance, predicate, property. Substance is kind of the typical Cartesian. The mind as substance is different from the things possessing physical properties, but somehow they interact. That's Descartes' idea. Predicate dualism is that mental content is real and must be accounted for, but it is different from physical stuff. So what you're starting to get here, and even with property, that consciousness is a fundamentally distinct property to physical functions. Now, general property dualism says they don't interact, but they do perceptually. So there is some kind of relationship with them. So in each of these situations, they're trying to define different things as being distinct, but they're still having to accept that there is a commonality, a relationship, an interaction, some kind of connection that they have with each other. And possibly one is influencing the other. We are certainly influenced by, if we are the mind and the outside world is perceived by us, it definitely affects us. So there is an effect, there is a relationship, there is some activity causally between us. So none of these are 100% dualistic. Epiphenomenalism is now regarded as a type of dualism because it's saying that consciousness is an emergent property of physics, but which basically means it is something which is different from the physics, from the properties of physics, but it's real. So that's showing relationship, that's showing something which is said to emerge, i.e. the effect is in the cause. I'm not saying that's correct. I'm just saying that the idea is not dualism in a strict sense, and nor is panpsychism, because it's actually defining many different things, many different properties, and somehow trying to relate them together through Russellian monism generally. Now, there's also Vedanta-inspired dualism. Again, I'm not going to go through these, but we have the Dvaita-vad of Madhava, the Vishishta-dvaita, which is qualified non-dualism of Ramanuja, Shuddha-dvaita, pure non-dualism, Dvaita-dvaita of Nimbarka. So you can study all these in your own leisure, and they've got incredible insights on the world and how we exist within it. But none of these are intended to be full-bloodedly dualistic. They will stress the dualism to a degree, to a high degree, but they're not intended to be 100% dualistic. So what I want to indicate is that monist and dualist ideas include one or more of each of these principles. The plurality of features, properties, entities, or natures of stuff. Or the idea that one aspect gives rise to another, and that's justified as the effect existing within the cause. So a relationship between cause and effect. Different aspects share some form of commonality, yet are declared to be distinctive from one another. So commonality and individuality together. And they contain differentiated aspects, sometimes claimed to be illusory, but they seem to have still some ontological status that makes them different. So all of these principles are contradictory to an idea that claims to be either pure monism or pure dualism. So both monism and dualism rely on concepts that contradict their claim to be either wholly monist or dualist. Now, all of these theories fall kind of in a spectrum of identifying variety and distinctions but within aspects of the relationships, oneness and commonality between their respective ontological features. They rely on simultaneous aspects of one and difference, all of them. If you plotted a chart, you might get something like this. I'm not going to say I've studied all the different theories, but I think it kind of works like this. It's a kind of inverse curve that the more oneness you want to establish and emphasize, the less difference you do. But it's always there. You never get back to zero either on oneness axis or on different axis. And it never tends, although the graph looks like it's tending, towards zero, it never does. It never goes below on the difference curve, below x1 or the oneness y1. Now, this is obviously figurative. There's no quantification that I can give behind this. It just shows that really when we're talking about monist and dualist ideas, we're not actually talking about the extremities of absolute monism or absolute dualism. We're talking about things which have a certain recognition of the oneness and difference, the simultaneous oneness and difference within their different constituent facets of the theories. Some ideas will stress the oneness aspect of certain principles, of certain natures, of certain ideas, at the expense of the difference. Some other theories will stress the difference to the expense of the commonality and the relationship, perhaps. So, and none of them are as fixed points as we've shown. They're all kind of blobs like this, spread out, covering a lot of different things. Now, both of them, dualism and monism, rely on concepts that contradict their claim as wholly monist or dualist. Oh, that sounds like the same slide has slipped in there. So these are binary notions, and that's their problem, that somehow or other we kind of think that the only theories of ontology are these binary absolutist notions. But, and I'm not trying to diminish the validity of many of the points that they make or even their conclusions. All I'm saying is that each of them contain internal philosophical inconsistencies. And if a philosophy is not internally consistent, then it needs to kind of look at its overall claim. And each of these philosophies are internally inconsistent and cannot qualify as either pure monism or pure dualism, because they rely on plurality, they rely on relationships, cause and effect, and commonality and distinctiveness. Therefore, I'm going to make the claim there are no such things as pure monism or pure dualism. Rather, there is only one ontological type of theory. So here I've kind of united them all, because although they were varied, they had commonality. And that is the only philosophy that exists. That all ontological theories fall into one category: simultaneous oneness and difference. And in keeping with this principle of simultaneous oneness and difference, they are all of one category, yet all these different theories have their own distinctiveness. Now, how to understand the whole in its relationship with its distinctive parts, this is what oneness and difference is looking at. It's trying to understand the whole in relationship with its distinctive parts, and it's also trying to understand the relationships of all the parts to one another. And in Sanskrit, we call this idea of simultaneous oneness and difference, beta, beta. So beta in Sanskrit means difference, and abeta, non-difference. So join them together, you've got beta, beta. So I've used this word compresent, simultaneous, co-present, oneness and difference. So I use that word compresent on purpose, just to focus on the principle that the two seemingly irreconcilable properties of oneness and difference reside in the ontological relationships between any two aspects of reality. Now, is this a philosophical contradiction? No. I read someone, philosopher, was trying to say, well, this is obviously, you know, when you've got oneness and difference, it's a contradiction. No. The real contradiction is trying to claim that there is pure Buddhism, pure dualism of pure monism, when it doesn't match its principles, premises, and all its statements. Now, you could say this is a grammatical contradiction, and in that sense, what it actually is an oxymoron. Now, an oxymoron is when you have two words together which sound like they should contradict. But actually, oxymorons have real value in the English language. Let me give you a few examples. Love-hate relationship, virtual reality, old news, friendly fire, deafening silence. All these are oxymorons. They contain words together which are meant to be simultaneously understood, even though they appear to be contradictory. But in each case, they kind of reveal new meanings and insights than the separate words would convey. Would you rather, if you were giving a talk, to have silence, or would you feel worse if someone said it was a deafening silence? You know, love-hate relationship is different from saying, well, they sometimes love each other and they sometimes hate each other. You know, friendly fire is very specifically explaining something that is not in either word. So when we bring two words together, we're actually got a chance to elucidate something, not create a contradiction. Now, is it a philosophical fudge? No. And I'm going to show you that it's actually absolutely how the only way in which humans can try to analyze the world around them. We use it all the time, and I'm going to show you it's rampant. Oneness and difference is the rampant approach used from maths to in all the sciences. Is it syncretic? Is it just a fusion of ideas? Are we taking this extremes of monism and dualism and bringing them together and say, oh, yeah, well, let's create a nice kind of hybrid compromise? No, it's not a compromise. What we're saying is that monism and dualism in their extreme sense are actually extremities. They are basically oneness and difference ontology extrapolated to ad absurdum, to a place where it's not meant to go. And we're not trying to resolve those, bring those two together. We're trying to say, cut them off. The extremities don't exist. Really, we have to look that there is one ontological system, which is oneness and difference. That's the one that exists. And is it counterintuitive? No. Let me give you examples. Ice and water. Are they the same or are they different? Composition is the same, but really they are different states of matter, solid and liquid. Milk and cream. Are they the same? They're actually the same substance, but there's a concentration in one which makes it distinct and exhibits different properties. And you might use milk in your cornflakes and cream in your tea. Sun and sunlight. The sunlight is different from the sun, but it emanates from the sun. The sunlight couldn't exist without the sun, but at the same time, we're enjoying a lot of sunlight today, and it feels like the sun is right with us, but it's still, you know, miles away. What about a spider and its web? The web is nothing but that which is produced from the body of the spider. Yet once it is extruded, it is different. You can't say the web is the spider anymore, but it is nothing but the spider. Now think about maths. It's a form of philosophical logic, perhaps more precise than any other, and at its basis, it relies on simultaneous oneness and difference. Here's a question for you. How many? Right, you got that? Now, those who can use the Facebook for the next one. How many? Go on, see if you can tell me how many. You're struggling now, aren't you? Because there's a number of different answers. And the real question is, how many of what? Is it, well, there's 5 apples and 3 oranges, or should you separate the green and red apples and then 3 oranges? Or is there 8 fruit things? Or could you say there is 1 batch? Now, what this indicates is that in order to count, you have to analyze what is the group of which I'm counting. And in order to form a group, you've got to identify the commonality between individual distinctive items. Like, say, the apples. If I say, well, I'm interested in apples because we're baking an apple tart. So it doesn't matter whether they're red, whether they're green. I'm just interested in apples. How many of them have I got? So I have formed my group. I've created a sense of commonality. I've defined the properties that I'm using to create the boundaries of this group. And now I've got the individuals to deal with. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So unless we apply a sense of sameness to several objects, we can't identify the extent of the group that we wish to quantify. This is called samanya, oneness, sameness, commonality. And similarly, unless we recognize the distinct existence of each individual within that group, we can't count them. Or we'll never get beyond 1, because if we don't recognize commonality, well, then we've got 1 apple, and this next is also an apple. But I'm not connecting it with that apple. It's just another thing. Therefore, I've got to make 1 again. And then I come upon something else, and it's number 1. So we need vishesha, the distinctive existence and individual character of a thing, and we need samanya. So maths absolutely relies on this principle. 2 simultaneous conditions have to exist for maths to work. There is actual difference so that you can distinguish each member and count them, and there is commonality so that you can group and your counting will be complete and you will have a picture, a quantification of that group. So that's maths. And equations work the same way. You know, on the left there is a function of x, on the other side is 0. 0 is not the same as a function, but putting it equal to 0 helps us to understand how that function works out. And in other concepts, chemistry, you've got a base and an acid, and that produces salt and water. Chemically, in terms of ions, the same ions are on both sides of the equation, but you wouldn't, although you could drink salt and water together, you wouldn't want to drink sodium hydroxide and hydrochloric acid. So there is distinction and commonality. And in physics, E equals mc squared, energy and mass are equivalent. But we know they are different, and we use them in different ways when we want to model things, when we want to release energy. We look and kind of say, well, can we destroy some mass within these atoms, in these isotopes? In the white is the Hamiltonian Schrödinger equation. That's too big for me to comment on. Singularity of Big Bang is an also example of Satkaryavad. Somehow or other there's the effect is there in the cause, and without really explaining how that works. And even the Linnaeus system of classification. If we look at the lion, Panthera, Leo, you have its group, its commonality, and its distinctive identification. So the group is Panthera, and its distinctive individual species is Leo. So this is the common way that we approach the world. Now, beta is an old philosophy, and really those dualist philosophies from the Vedas that I mentioned earlier really are a form of beta thinking. but it was probably best articulated by Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and his followers in the 16th century, and really described in this word, and it says avincha, but it means achintya. Achintya beda beda tattva. Apologies for the spelling mistake there. So achintya beda beda tattva, the truth of the inconceivable, simultaneous oneness and difference of all existence. All that exists is the interplay of many variegated and interdependent energies, unified by their status as the products of a single absolute source. It uses this word achintya, probably has many different significance to be brought out by this word. I'm just going to offer three that come to my mind. One, achintya, is it acknowledges our difficulty conceptualizing how the whole of existence may be ontological variegated yet united at the same time. We probably have this unfortunate tendency, although we experience the world as variegated, we want to think of our philosophy as binary, one or the other. So allowing ourselves to conceive of variegatedness within unity, that's harder. The second point is that in understanding aspects of samanya and vishesha, which we will apply in our analysis of the relationship of consciousness, mind, and the world, we cannot know all the properties and qualities that may exist. We may know some of them, and so there's always going to be an achintya element, something that we do not know, haven't conceived of, in terms of our relationship between the parts and the whole. And the third, I think, is interesting, that although this ontology can be applied at our everyday level, and that's kind of where we're going next week. When I say everyday level, we're looking at the philosophy of this world and our conscious interaction with it. But really, this philosophy is so comprehensive that it applies all the way to the point of reality and existence that is beyond our ability to fathom and explore through our minds, through our philosophy, through our sciences, through any way. It goes far beyond it. Therefore, it actually covers not only all we can know, it covers even things that we are yet or may never know. Hence, it's achintya. So, oneness and difference brings in these kind of key points. Reality. All aspects of our model are real or actual. Relationships. All the elements of our model can interact. Cause and effect. That we will show how the effect is in some way contained within the cause. We will talk about commonality and distinctiveness, samanya and vishesha. And we explain all of this and tie it all together because we postulate that in order for this to work, there must be a singular underlying source, an ultimate cause of all manifestations. So, the idea that there is an underlying cause is a kind of postulation that is standard in philosophy and science. It's a common factor. The differences are how people might choose to describe that source. But there is only one reality, but it is illogical to say that it is undifferentiated. The absolute reality must be such that it can accommodate and handle all the plurality we know of and so much more. It is now, I've gone a little bit beyond the time, so I'm just going to run to our final point because some of this I can deal with next week. So just to summarize what I hope we've established today. And oh, by the way, if anyone wants to start putting questions into Facebook, we'll take a few minutes to go through them, but I apologize, this has been a long session. The things that we want to establish and where we're going from next. And remember, we're doing this on the foundation that consciousness is a fundamental non-neural feature of reality, distinct from the mind and the brain, etc. So, properties. We've said that we're going to analyze consciousness, mind, and physical matter in terms of their properties and functions. We are leaving the issue of substance aside because we don't know what the substance of physical matter is, never mind trying to do it in terms of mind and consciousness. But we are going to model those properties on their substrate. And that's next week. Energy and information. Physical matter is best understood as energy and information manifesting observable properties. Remember the electron? A packet of information located at a point in space. So physical matter best understood as energy and information. But the information that is contained within it manifests to us as observable properties. And we're accepting the reality of consciousness, mind, and matter. And we recognize that they're real and can interact because we are applying those principles we just stated of beta, oneness and difference, to explore the relationships and interactions of these aspects. This, before we are able to really look at these interaction of consciousness and matter, these are the points that have to be established. Now, if anyone wants a little homework, I would put it out to you. Have you any suggestion for any better properties or any better principles than these four on which to analyze the interaction of consciousness as a fundamental property of reality with the external world? So, if you've got ideas, we'll try and incorporate them. Otherwise, we'll kind of move to our questions and answers for now. Okay. And the question is, does the Atma paradigm reject idealism? We reject idealism if by idealism you mean, is there not a world out there? We accept that there is something out there which is giving rise to the properties that we perceive. So we do not believe either in the idealism of that is attributed to Berkeley, that the only thing that exists is the mind. Nor do we subscribe to the idea that you can just think of this world as the Matrix or some virtual reality existence that is being programmed for us, but the program that, or the experiences we're having, are simply virtually generated. I use that example of the match of the day thing, just to show how it is possible to formulate such an idea, but unless you can tie the and give some kind of way of grounding the properties that we experience to some actual object which gives rise to them, then you haven't you're not really able to explain the world. So my point to you all is, do not change the way you think of the world. It is as real as you've always assumed it to be. When you wake up tomorrow, brush your teeth, have breakfast, do your work, do all the things that you're meant to do. Don't try and ignore that. Another question has come up. Why should we subscribe to the energy and information explanation of matter? Consider it is one of the transitory theories put forward by scientists. No, actually, what we're going to show is that on this aspect, science has analyzed matter, which it always assumed was substantial, i.e. was made of substance, and when they actually get down to it, they realize that really all they have ever been looking at is properties and functions, and that they have only defined matter in terms of what it is like and what it does, i.e. that we give an electron is something we have given a set of properties. We have defined a set of properties for it in order to explain what we needed to do according to what we have seen happen. So these are the properties that we have given them are actually just our own way of modeling, and it's not the only way of modeling matter, as we shall see next week. So we're not relying on the science discovering that the world is made of energy and information. Actually, that has been the assumption of ontological philosophies for thousands of years. It is part of the Sankhya, and it just happens that currently physics has started to realize that's what they're dealing with. So we've run a little over time, well over time. We shall unfortunately have to conclude. Next week I hope you can join me. It's for 2.3 actually, and it's going to be hard and soft matter, and we're going to be looking at the flow of information from hard to soft matter, and we'll have to cover a few points that we missed today. But thank you very much, and I look forward to being with you all next week.